Merlin. Have you been? I have walked my way since the beginning of time. Sometimes I give, sometimes I take. It is mine to know which and where.
We have a long legacy of accounts of wizards, necromancers, conjurers, and all the other many names that we have for these incredible sorcerers. Is there some way that they're linked behind the construction of these wondrous edifices that we look at in our explorations every week? Whether we're thinking of some sort of fantasy wizard or perhaps something a little bit more contemporary, such as an alchemist's den, is there a connection to these explorations that we do? Is there a way that they're intrinsically linked? And if so, who are these wizards? And how do they fit into our account and our understanding of the old world and the civilization that came before ours? Join me today as we explore this account of these wizards and how they may be responsible for some of the incredible constructions that we've looked at. Why is it that there is such a link between wizards and fantasy and castles as we explore the wizards of Tartaria? Who were the wizards of Tartaria? We've oftentimes heard of historical accounts that relate to Alchemist's Den, and many of us think about our recent experiences. From my particular generation, our first exposure to wizards came from the Wizard of Oz, and actually the witches, who were wizards in and of themselves. Again, relating to the many different names that we have for conjurers. But who exactly is a wizard? And we might recall that in the story of the Wizard of Oz, the eponymous Wizard of Oz was actually not a wizard, but merely an individual that was utilizing theatricality and deception to present themselves as a wizard in order to influence decisions, and ultimately to bring good to the land of Oz, depending on one's perspective. But we look at other accounts of wizards, and we see that there is a rather conflicted account, as always, where we see some wizards who appear to be good and use their powers to bring about what we consider to be favorable outcomes for the progress of a civilization. And yet there's other accounts of wizards that appear to be evil, who use their powers for relentless destruction. And as we look at all of our fantasy accounts and our legends, and we can find wizards all the way back to the beginning of our written accounts. And once again, it's something else that transcends many different cultures and civilizations. Whether they're called wizards or sorcerers is immaterial, but individuals who appear to have some sort of special power. The ability to conjure matter where matter didn't exist. The ability to use what we would call magic. Is it really just simply magic where a wandering of a hand or some incantation can bring about some sort of result or affect the physical environment? Looking at the other accounts, we even have no shortage of linkages between wizards being evil figures and linked to the ultimate evil. But is this true, or is this merely one series of these accounts? Why is it so difficult to get a clear picture of what a wizard actually is? We do know for sure that wizards have always been with us. But did wizards really start as a part of our civilization, or were they something that were added later? It's really intriguing when you think about how we have these accounts of these alchemists, or the account of the alchemist's den. And what's really the difference between an alchemist and what you would think of as a wizard? There's also that question of why we have so many different names and references to wizards, whether we're saying a sorcerer, a conjurer, a warlock, a witch, and the terms go on. And there are many different terms if we consider many other languages. Were these some sort of special group of people? Were they a completely different species from humanity even? Or could it be that they are simply humans that were endowed with different abilities? Were they endowed from birth, or were they abilities that they had to learn over a period of time? Looking at all of our stated fictional accounts over time, we see that there are many different ways that an individual can become a wizard or a conjurer or sorcerer or sorceress or whatever different name you want to apply. Some were born with the ability. Others were trained over time with the ability. And yet we have other accounts of some that were endowed with the ability even against their will. But because they had some sort of natural capability, they were able to become a wizard or a sorcerer. Indeed, we think of the Marvel example of Doctor Strange. And oddly enough, I would even refer to the account of the 1970s Doctor Strange TV series because it actually deals with the astral plane. And while I'm well aware that there are many different examples of wizards that are certainly more contemporary, the ones that I'm referring to in this exploration have to do with the concept of wizards operating and existing in different planes of existence, almost being a dream and a reality. Indeed, in John Boorman's 1981 film Excalibur, we actually see different examples of wizards, from Merlin to Morgana. Morgana appearing to be a human, and yet utilizing her wit and her guile, is able to actually acquire the powers of the conjurer and use it to affect the plot. And then we also look at the existence of the wizards from the Lord of the Rings series from J.R.R. Tolkien. And we understand that these particular wizards are not actually human beings, but they're spirits, the Maiar, from an entirely higher plane of existence. Is it possible that this is what these account of wizards really are? That they're a completely different race of people that came from another plane of existence? Or perhaps we can't even think of them as a different race of people. Perhaps they're a completely different sort of creature, a more ethereal creature that manages to assume human form. And perhaps that's what's always made wizards so compelling to us, is the different explanations that they may possess. And how do we link this back to our studies and understanding of the old world? Is it possible that previous civilizations interacting with different portals and different forms of existence actually managed to contact these life forms, or this entirely different form of life that was more energy, or perhaps we'd even describe it as spiritual based now? Is that really what the Good Witch actually is? The incarnation of some sort of spirit? Is that what a lot of these wizards or sorcerers have been over time? Actual spirits that assumed a corporeal form and then looked to influence the previous civilization. Indeed, that's what a lot of accounts will tell us, and yet we can't ignore the fact that going all the way back from Arthurian legends to even the modern day, well, relatively modern day Wizard of Oz, or perhaps even the Harry Potter series, we have that wizards do appear to be regular people that are simply endowed with powers. And I certainly invite you to let me know what you think of wizards or sorcerers when you think of them in the comments. How would you describe one? And what was your thought of what their capabilities really were? Can they conjure things? Can they cast spells? Or do they actually have the ability to really manipulate the entire physical environment at will, all around us and all around them? Is it possible that there is still some form of this knowledge, this practice that exists to this day? And is it even possible that there are some human beings to this day that are still endowed with this incredible ability? These are perhaps the most intriguing possibilities. Now, of course, the mainstream and modern science will tell us that this is absurd and that this has been disproven time and time again. And that is certainly the conclusion that's been reached. But yet the legends and the legacies of these wizards, these conjurers, it just does not go away. Their identity, their presence, and the fact that they're still with us, even in a fictionalized world, tells of their lasting legacy. We think of the role that the wizard Merlin played in what we would consider to be the foundation of a reference to the old world, with the kingdom of King Arthur. Because we understand that the way the individuals in that story acted is certainly nothing like what we understand individuals who actually lived in the historical Middle Ages to have acted. There is a significant discrepancy between what really happened, again according to the historical account, and what Arthurian legend states happened during the time frame of the Middle Ages. So we can only conclude that they're referring to very different time frames. When you see these accounts of wizards, though, you consider the mixture of good and evil. And indeed, there are many who simply attribute that all wizards and all forms of conjuring is simply that, the very practice itself is evil. Indeed, it relates to alchemy in that facet, that it is dark arts that should not be practiced, because they could lead to a terrifying result. And yet we could also come to the same conclusion about our modern technology. Our modern technology can bring about favorable results to individuals and to entire civilizations, and yet it can also be destructive to individuals and entire civilizations. And perhaps this is the most compelling evidence that we have of our conclusion in terms of what role wizards played if they did exist in the past. And it's safe to say that there are still some signs, some indications that there really were people who had enhanced capabilities. And some of them may even still be with us today. Is it possible that in the past that these enhanced capabilities went even further? That these conjurers were really capable of bringing about entirely new realms of physical existence? Did they have the capability to simply produce life with the waving of their hands, or the casting of spells, or even mixing of different forms of potion with different forms of understanding? It's very difficult for us to describe and understand, especially those of us who have lived in what we see as an entirely physical world. But we do have accounts of the fact that many people in the past feared wizards and sorcerers and conjurers, and attributed them to evil, and handled them as such. And yet there's other accounts, such as Merlin, of these wizards being the ones who crafted and helped form the early steps of a civilization. Indeed, you can point to the very essential role that Merlin played in bringing about the Kingdom of Camelot. Is it possible that some other wizards were responsible for bringing about a civilization, an ancient technology, an etheric energy that they practiced? And understanding what this etheric technology really is, perhaps that's the key to understanding how these incredible civilizations managed to achieve the things that they did, especially with the constructions that we look at in our explorations. What is etheric energy, and what is the understanding of these wizards? Well, we look at the account of the spirits in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and we have an understanding that spirits existed in a completely different realm, a place that's outside of what we understand as our physical existence. Now, we could certainly look at this as a different spiritual existence, another plane of existence, and as they refer to in Doctor Strange, the TV miniseries from 1970s, they talk about an astral plane. Again, it's another realm, a different form, a completely different place from where we are right now. A lot of people may say that it's simply imaginary, and it could well be. But I think it is one interesting perspective to try to attempt to understand where the presence of wizards and even etheric energy or spiritual energy may come from. It could be entirely possible that there is this place that exists. And I even think of the more contemporary reference in the Warhammer 40k universe where they talk about the warp zone, or the completely different area where different energies exist. You still have what may be viewed as the spiritual existence of individuals. And perhaps it is true that every single one of us does have a very distinct form of spiritual energy. Some may refer to it as a spirit, others may refer to it as an aura. There's many different ways to perceive it, that there appears to be a intrinsic energy within all of us. Now, is it just simply something that we could easily explain with current scientific methods? Perhaps. Or could it actually allude to something far different? Something that enables us to exist in multiple realities, multiple realms at the same time. And then we have another explanation for the origin of wizards. We have another understanding of where the power and the use of conjuring is actually derived from. The ability to link to this other realm, this spiritual realm. And if you study the account of the spirits, as J.R.R. Tolkien refers to in Lord of the Rings and all of his ephemeral materials, you can start to gain an understanding for how there is a completely different realm. You can have a perspective for where these spirits tend to exist and how they're able to take form in the physical realm, and yet they still have access to the greater powers from their other realm. Or perhaps there's more of a technological explanation for it. Perhaps there really is a capability or a technology that existed in the past that enabled corporeal forms or people in our reality to connect to other realities, other forms of existence where they were able to draw on a special energy, an energy from that other form of existence that they were able to incorporate and utilize in our present reality. And perhaps that is one of the easiest ways to understand wizards and conjurers. Perhaps that's the very origin of their power, the origin of what we would consider to be the etheric energy. But there's many different perspectives behind it, and I certainly invite you to share your opinion in the comments. What do you think is the origin of it? And what do you think is the true nature of these wizards? Looking here, we actually have the genealogy of the Ainar, or the Aenar. There's many different ways to pronounce it. The spirits that existed in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings series. The highest of the spirits being the Valar. Essentially deities in many ways, and yet deities with their own characteristics and their own particular forms of individuality. And then we have the other spirits, the Maiar. And if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, you might recall that the Maiar actually incarnated as 5 wizards to assist humanity, the elves, the dwarves, and the other physical beings that existed in J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth at the time. There's also the fact that there were dark spirits, or shadow spirits, that took other forms that were far more terrifying and horrific, to even include the demons of the ancient world, or the Balrogs, who were actually demons themselves, originally spirits. Also looking at the account of the original Morgoth, who was one of the Valar who became corrupted. And it's here that we see a lot of the origin stories for our own current perception of good and evil. Is it possible that there's a lot more to this account that we don't understand to this day? Is it possible that there are other forms of spirits that may have incarnated in some sort of corporeal existence? We think of one of the Maiar, or one of the other spirits from J.R.R. Tolkien's legend that incarnated as Sauron, the Dark Lord, and consider the fact that perhaps this is where we have all these accounts of evil that tend to be associated with wizards. But not all wizards start off as evil or began as evil. In fact, many were good, such as the 5 wizards who were sent to Middle-earth to help the elves, humanity, the dwarves, and all the others with managing the return of an ancient evil to the land. Who exactly were these people? We understand that they were spirits such as Saruman that took corporeal form to provide their wisdom and their aid, and yet some were corrupted such as Saruman. And then there was Gandalf, who started off as Gandalf the Grey, and then was reincarnated as Gandalf the White to take over the Order. There was Radagast, who did not prefer to play an active role with humanity, but rather with the animals, and then simply returned. And then there's the lesser-known blue wizards, who went far out east, and we don't exactly know what their fate is. Is it possible that what Tolkien was really referring to was some sort of historical event that may have occurred? Is it possible that there were wizards in the past, or perhaps even individuals who had greater capabilities, who managed to survive what we think of as a reset, and then they were the ones who came to the new civilization to guide it and to help it establish itself? And much like the wizards in J.R.R. Tolkien's account, perhaps the wizards in reality were also susceptible to corruption. That there were some who, instead of deciding to utilize their knowledge and their power for good, decided to utilize their knowledge and power for evil and corruption, because for whatever reason they had become corrupted. Think on that. Think on the capabilities of the power that wizards could have. There's also the ongoing mentality that we have that's referred to in some stories, such as in the film Big Trouble in Little China and in the film Excalibur, where we see that wizards may have different forms of existence, that they can be corporeal, but they can lose their corporeal bodies and then only exist as spirits, or as it's referred to in both of those films, they are merely dreams. And yet they are still dreams that can interface with the physical world and influence the physical world. Indeed, the sorcerer Lo Pan in Big Trouble in Little China is trying to recover from a curse to regain his physical body. And that's one of the main plot points of that particular film. There's the account of Merlin in the 1981 film Excalibur, who begins as a corporeal being, but then loses his form and only exists as a shadow or a spirit. And how do we explain the construction? Well, we have this link back to the concept of alchemy. Now, is alchemy really a form of conjuring, or is it just simply more of a form of knowledge? A knowledge of mixing different materials and having the capability to produce and yield other materials. And this is where we see the real explanation for how wizards may have played a very active role in our understanding of the old world. Indeed, a lot of the symbolism in the old world perspective involves having a physical realm. But then as you work your way out from the physical realm, you reach what we would consider to be the ethereal realms, the astral plane, and there's many different terms for it. And perhaps this is referencing the connection between our reality and other realities. It's not simply a product of the imagination or science fiction. It's possible that there could be a true connection. Because many people say there are so many things that we can't quantify, that we can't measure by science, such as emotional connections. And perhaps there's many other outcomes that we simply can't explain with measuring something with a cup or some sort of device. It's just simply not possible. And yet perhaps the real link between a scientific understanding and a spiritual understanding comes from this amalgamation, this concept of this existence between the ability of alchemy and a spiritual existence. Now just imagine if you had the ability to do both, if it was a combination of knowledge with endowed capability, or an even higher knowledge of a way to access one of these realms. Perhaps this is what alchemy is really referring to, and perhaps this is the reference that we have, the understanding for how not only were they able to construct these incredible structures that are still with us today, but they were actually able to produce the impressive and enduring construction materials, which we don't seem to have the ability to match to this day. There's a reason why we still associate castles as a fairy tale existence, and the simple explanation is because many times their construction seems impossible. Now, yes, there are more rudimentary castles that we could say we could construct to this day, employing all of our methods, but yet there are other castles that you can find across the land, or palaces, or whatever term we want to assign to them, that seem to be completely beyond our capability to construct. And we've looked at many of these structures in our exploration on this channel. Is it possible that the Wizards of Tartaria are the ones who really were endowed with the knowledge that made these constructions possible? Something that defies our ability to explain with our current means of construction, but may be very easily explained if we consider the process of alchemy, and if we consider the wizards or the alchemists or the conjurers who had the knowledge, a different story of lost records. Perhaps we all have this intrinsic ability locked within all of us, and we simply lack the knowledge to tap into these other realms, these other forms of reality, and to draw on this etheric energy, this energy that we could then channel from this other reality into our present physical reality. And that's why we have all these accounts and all these stories of these conjurers, these alchemists in the past, who made such a difference on their civilization. And perhaps as we go further back in the past, we had examples of wizards who had even greater capability, such as Merlin. Not only were they able to create or to facilitate the creation of these incredible construction materials, but they also had a knowledge of an older civilization, perhaps even a higher form of being for the physical realm that we have. And this is perhaps the most interesting accounts that we have of wizards, why they continue to endure with us to this day. It's not just simply the ability to wave your hands and to produce incredible physical results. It comes down to having an innate knowledge, a knowledge that actually goes beyond physical limitations. Because we have the fantasy perception of wizards as battling demons and creatures from other dimensions, and perhaps there may even be a form of truth to that. Perhaps that's something that still occurs to this very day that goes on behind the scenes, or perhaps it occurs in a reality that we're not even able to perceive. Could it have been that the alchemists of the past were the very last generation or the last group of individuals that really had this higher knowledge, this ability to tap into other realms and this etheric energy, to employ it in a way that could affect the physical world? Is this the reason why they were so feared and so despised at the time? That there were others that may have resented their existence? Or is it possible there was even a schism between these higher knowledged individuals? That there was one group that wanted to preserve the original values of a civilization, and there was another group that decided to corrupt it for their own means and power. And indeed, we find analogies to this, especially in the 1981 film Excalibur, where we see that there's an individual that has a form of righteousness to them, and even one of their family members was wronged, but in the aspect of pursuing their revenge, they become the worst evil themselves. It's a story that repeats in many time frames, and in many different inclinations we have the idea that all of us are susceptible to this form of corruption, that all of us have the ability to be good, and all of us have the ability to be evil. Now imagine if we had greater capabilities. Imagine if all of us could really influence the physical world in much greater ways. And as stated earlier, perhaps we do actually have this capability and it's locked away within us somewhere. That it's something that we could gain an understanding of if we're actually able to pursue the knowledge. Or it could all simply be the product of fantasy. Perhaps it was merely some esoteric knowledge or something that was just a little different than what the mainstream understanding was at the time, and over time it's been inflated by legend and myth. Although I'm always amazed by how many times there seems to really be something behind legend and myth. How there seems to be a lot more reality behind it than we might initially like to think. And some would even argue that our historical accounts going back to Rome are really based on legend and myth, although that's merely one perception, and I'm not embracing that or saying that's the correct way to look at it. Just that it's very interesting that we have very limited accounts from events that occurred 2,000 years ago, and yet we're able to derive and have a detailed understanding of exactly what unfolded. Always very interesting that we have so much question about what transpired in the 1800s, and yet we could tell you what Julius Caesar was having for dinner right before he was assassinated. Now, yes, I'm embellishing that a little bit, but you understand the point. How could we actually have more detail from more distant times in the past than what we have presently? And what do wizards really represent? Are they just a fantasy element in our minds to explain things we don't understand? Or is there a reality behind them? Because when you look at every palace, every opera house that we understand were constructed from the 15 to the 1800s, do we really attribute them to being constructed by the technological means at the time as we understand them, given our official historical account? Or is it possible that there had to be a higher knowledge that was applied? We theorize that there oftentimes was a higher knowledge and a greater capability that was applied. How do you actually circumvent logistical limitations unless you had a true greater capability? Someone who had a greater understanding of geometric precision. But not only that, the ability to fabricate materials that would endure not just for tens of years, but for hundreds or even thousands of years. Now, of course, the official explanation for this will be that some people had a greater knowledge of material construction, or it's simply medieval masonry, and that explains everything. And yet there's a conflicting account with our understanding of knowledge during the medieval times or Middle Ages, and it does not correspond with the results of the structures that we see to this day. There's also many other discrepancies that we have with the timeline, or the time frame, with many of these constructions being completed over a period of hundreds of years, which gives problems, as opposed to the constructions within the United States that tend to have been completed in a very short amount of time. So the account seems to differ depending where you are in the land, and yet the results that you can actually see when you don't consider the historical account are very similar. So is it really showing a difference in capability, or is it showing a previous civilization that all existed at the same time frame? Ultimately, that's your conclusion to make. And all are welcome here to express their opinion, whether you embrace the mainstream historical chronology or if you believe that there is an alternative explanation for why we have these incredible structures. The exploration of the wizards is one theory, one possible explanation for why it was we were able to construct in this manner, and why we were able to do it all over the land, with tremendous results. There's many places that we haven't explored yet that we will continue to explore, looking at what our historical account is and trying to gain an understanding. But we're also going to continue to posit more theories as we go forward, trying to understand exactly what it was that occurred in our past. And I never pull anything off the table, because I believe that many more things are possible than are impossible than what we'd like to believe. How exactly do you explain a structure like this, constructed in the distant past? And do we have remaining wizards to this day? Let's consider the example of Lopan.
The fairies are out of balance.
As they are in Lopan, who is cursed.
Then the people turn into demon and live forever.
This David Lopan, what is he, a ghost?
Plays at being a man.
And perhaps this is the example I referred to along with the example of Merlin. Two individuals who are sorcerers, wizards, who attempted to affect the outcome of the physical environment in their respective stories. I've always found, though, the account and the portrayal of Merlin in the 1981 film Excalibur to be the most compelling. We understand that Merlin is some sort of immortal individual. He does not age, despite the passage of many decades in the story, and he tries to positively affect the outcome of establishing a true balanced civilization. And for a time frame in the film, with King Arthur and Camelot, they do establish a balanced civilization. And yet in the process of doing this, though, the seeds of its destruction were already sown, namely because of the fact that Merlin, despite being a wizard, does make mistakes. I also appreciate the fact, though, in the portrayal in this particular film, that Merlin is not human. There seems to be something more behind him, and maybe that's the real explanation behind wizards. And indeed, there is the line that Morgana says that he's not a man, he's not a god. And perhaps that is very, very true. And yet Merlin does actually bring about the positive outcome of Camelot. His initial attempt fails when he puts his support behind King Uther, namely because of the fact that while King Uther is a great warrior, as Merlin says, he was never able to look into the hearts of men, most of all his own. And as a result of this led to his own downfall when he betrayed the Duke of Cornwall. The Duke of Cornwall's daughter, Morgana, seeking revenge many years later, manages to steal magic from Merlin and brings about the ruination of the land. A very compelling story. And I think what's also interesting is the fact that Merlin has a special relationship and takes an active role in raising Arthur, which is very different than Uther. Morgana also attempts to raise her own child, endowed with magic, to bring about a different sort of land. And I appreciate the portrayal by Helen Mirren in this very complex and interesting character, because I believe this may be telling us stories that occurred in the past. There's also the facet that Merlin was the one who was responsible for taking care of Arthur. Now, while he did not actually raise Arthur, he certainly watched over him, and also played a significant role as Arthur's mentor once Arthur came of age and began his quest to unify the land. And Merlin became a primary advisor, a friend, and a father figure to Arthur. And it's very intriguing to me when you watch the film the different way in which Uther, Arthur's father, and Arthur himself regard Merlin. Uther seems to have no time for Merlin and pays him no respect. And Arthur is saddened when Merlin leaves, when Merlin says that he's going to depart, with the great line that there are worlds other than this, and this one is done with me. Perhaps what we see in this portrayal, this depiction in the film Excalibur, is the most realistic form of what wizards may have once been. Or perhaps it's something else entirely. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. How do you view wizards and conjurers? What do you believe is their actual origin? And what role do you think they played in the old world? Or perhaps I'll just leave Merlin's departing line. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
A dream to some.
A nightmare to others!
Aqueduct of the Free Waters in Lisbon, Portugal, built 1731 to 1748 on the orders of King Yao V, or John V. It includes commemorative arches and was funded by a sales tax. Nobody needs a central bank or income tax. It even survived an earthquake in 1755, one of the worst ones on record. Come join me as we explore the incredible old world sites in the land we call Iberia. I've received many questions about what I consider to be one of the most densely populated, or perhaps one of the most dense areas of remaining Old World infrastructure and structures. And that land happens to be Iberia. Iberia, the incredible peninsula on Western Europe. Oftentimes a land that's overlooked by many of the magnificent sights that are across the continent of Europe, a continent which does include the nation of Russia. The grandeur of Iberia. So many sights, so many structures, palaces, monasteries, aqueducts. And it should be noted that we traditionally associate aqueducts with the Romans. But the aqueduct that we started off this exploration with was defined to have been built by Portugal and on the orders of a king. And when we look around, we see that there are many elaborate examples of architecture. There's also the unique historical perspective of the Iberian Peninsula. And whatever your thoughts are on history, there's a lot of unique nuances to it. For example, we do have a history, at least an established history, that goes all the way back to Paleolithic and Neolithic period. It includes the Romans. It includes the medieval times. It includes a vast struggle by two great empires. Yes, always a struggle between empires. And whether it was the Caliphate or whether it was the Kingdom of Spain and subsequent Kingdom of Portugal, there remains many incredible Old World sites, with many different explanations concerning their origins. And yet we have to ask the question as we look at these impressive Old World sites in this land that includes the Stairway to Heaven, what was their actual origin? Now, it could be possible that the official historical account given to us is correct. But if you do a little critical thinking, or apply a little critical thinking, if you actually look at the account of any single structure and compare it with other structures, and compare it with a timeline, to include the account of how the incredible aqueduct in Lisbon, Portugal that we looked at to start this exploration was funded, you start to find discrepancies. Now, to be fair, those discrepancies can be explained by the fact that there may be mistakes in the official historical record. Because we always ask the question, while we have historians who study history, who actually kept the original record? Who was charged with documenting events as they happened? Now, if you've served recently in the United States military, you'll know that there's a form called a DD 1594. It is simply a log, and oftentimes a lower-ranking soldier or Marine or whoever you have on hand is charged with maintaining this log. They write down every event that it happened, and they do so by hand. Subsequently, it is then typed into a computer, unless of course you have a higher headquarters. How was the construction of this particular gorgeous structure documented then? Was it done by the chroniclers of the kingdom? Was it done by traveling troubadours? Or was it simply reassessed by history after the fact? And maybe they didn't actually have an explanation, such as we encountered when we explored the great castle of Malbork in Central Europe in what is today Poland. But the many incredible sites that we have in the land that we call Iberia, or the Iberian Peninsula, which officially includes Portugal and Spain as the largest nations, but it also includes many other nations, many other autonomous areas that we oftentimes overlook. And when you're actually on the ground in this particular land, you will find that there are many incredible sites that have a lot of depth to them. In fact, if you're really looking for just simply the amount of Old World sites in a very dense area, in other words, the most amount of surviving Old World architecture, I would say that Iberia has a strong claim, for whatever reason, reasons that we don't know, to having these incredible examples. And when you look around, you'll see everything that we've seen across the land. Many domes, many pediments, many arches, and yet so much of this architecture survives. Many of these structures did actually reach us. And some of the most elaborate and adorned and decorated cathedrals and churches. And of course, there's also the conflicting account in terms of if these churches or these religious sites, what their origin was, and which particular religion was responsible for ordering and carrying out their construction. And whatever the true origin behind these structures are, you can't help but notice that you really are in a different land. A land that wherever you came from, if you walk across it, you will find numerous examples. And perhaps it might even be safe to say that if we go by the 5 eras theory, you will also find the most amount of surviving architecture and structures that allude to the possible existence of previous eras. Because there's no shortage of what on this channel we call star forts, or geometrically precise foundation structures. And perhaps I should have thought about that. You also have surviving examples of trolleys and the so-called inclined little railroad that still exists in many of these towns and cities across the Iberian Peninsula. And during this overview, we're really just looking at all the great examples. We are going to look at a few specific examples, and dependent on the result and the response to this particular exploration, we will be looking in more depth at several sites within the wondrous Iberian Peninsula. But you might be asking, how could they possibly afford to construct commemorative arches, or the many arches, the Arches of Triumph, and all the other examples that showcase the primacy and the capability of a civilization? Could anybody build something like this today? I mean, we think about going to other lands, and we know, for example, in the United States, the use of the trolley has declined immensely, and it's only affiliated and associated with the city of San Francisco to this day. Yet you can go across different sites in Portugal and Spain, and you can find that there are trolleys and inclined railroads that are still in use. And why is that the situation? What would it be like if we had this kind of transportation that was all over the place? It seems as though these may be surviving examples that, for whatever reason from the previous civilization, were not removed from service. Now, could that simply be a sign of the particular civilization or the particular society, that it has some difference, that it has some autonomy? That may be possible. And we are going to look in more detail at the numerous accounts that we have of the Iberian Peninsula, because, as the official account would have it, there are actual autonomous regions that function. There's also no shortage of incredible structures that we're told are castles. Castles that were constructed for defensive purposes. Wondrous fixed-site fortifications. And of course, one of the oldest adages or sayings in military history is that fixed fortifications are a monument to the stupidity of humanity. And why is that? Because even if you build a great wall that completely walls off a nation from another nation, there are still accounts of it being attacked and successfully invaded. Numerous accounts. And it's the same thing for the Iberian Peninsula, even with the severely restrictive terrain. You also find some of the most incredible examples of the great cathedrals that we've looked at. No shortages of palaces. And not just palaces that were stated to have been constructed in the 15 to the 1700s, but also structures that were constructed in the 1800s, and some even in the early 1900s, on a very short timeline. Simply looking at the overlapping examples of architecture, you might think, and it could be understood to have the thoughts, that this really does reflect the official historical account. But if we step back a little bit and we look at every individual structure and its particular account, how it was funded, how it was constructed, we always have a lack of information, even for the structures that were constructed as recent as the 1920s. And of course, many people will say, well, it's well documented, and of course anybody could do this if they were so inclined. Of course, the King of Portugal could fund an incredible aqueduct in the 1700s just by raising a sales tax. They didn't need a central bank back then, and they most certainly didn't need income taxes. And the question I would have is, who was actually so well off in Portugal at that time that they could actually provide those kind of income taxes? You do find an overlap of what does appear to be different societies and civilizations, although if you step far enough back, you could really say the same thing for any area in the land. Last time that I was in Portugal and Spain, it was in the early 2000s, and I recall even then, when I had a different set of eyes and perhaps a very different perspective, being taken aback by just how much incredible, what I thought at the time, was historical architecture. And I suppose whatever our perspective is, and whatever your perspective is, it really is historical architecture. And it is impressive that it survives to this day. Towers and domes and masonry construction. And many people simply hand-wave this away by saying it was merely the result of artisans and craftsmen who were all over the place, who could very easily construct these wonderful structures. And that may be so. But how is it at a time when we're informed that the regular population did not have the same opportunities for education? It didn't have the same capability to really express itself. That there were esoteric arts of craftsmanship that explains the construction of these structures. And yet, we still never have an explanation for how the logistical feats were pulled off. And it doesn't matter whether you think it was the Moors, or you think it was the Spanish, or the Portuguese, or whoever. And by the way, there's even an account that Germans at one point in time were the main population group in the Iberian Peninsula. Yes, so really every single population group seems to have been here. And you could attribute some alternative history of some account of how they managed to construct these structures. The reality is we just don't know. We don't know who actually built these incredible structures. We do have examples of every sort of architectural styling. And by all means, I invite you in the comments to let me know who or what you think was responsible for these structures. And just label the timestamp where you see them, and what's the background behind them. We oftentimes think of the Gaudi architecture, and what a very fitting name for it. Some of the most elaborate and beautiful architecture. There's also other anomalies within the Iberian Peninsula, beyond the structures. The very natural landscape itself, which contains a beauty and seems to have an identity to it that goes further back than we might like to think. How old is this area, and is there any particular significance to this landmark? Is it natural, or is it possible it has an artificial feature to it? You also have the way that the islands and the very landscape and the beaches are lined up. Again, asking the same questions. Are they natural or are they artificial? It's such a small area, and yet it's so densely packed with so many different examples of incredible old world architecture and beautiful land. And so, perhaps, regardless of what your particular perspective is, I could certainly recommend the Iberian Peninsula as a place you should visit. And whatever your perspective on the origin of these structures really is, you could certainly enjoy it for all of its impressive beauty. And I certainly invite you to interact with these structures as you can, because many of these structures you can interact with. There's also numerous examples of surviving old world architecture that's in every city, every small town, every village. And oftentimes it's located in remote areas that you might ask that question, how did they do this logistically? Because, as I'm fond of saying, that's never an answer we tend to get, whether we're examining structures in the United States, in Russia, in Europe, and South America. And it was the exploration of South America that caused me to want to go back and take a closer look at the Iberian Peninsula. And I realized we really hadn't done many explorations that were centered on Iberia yet. And I thought this was the opportunity to really introduce it. One of the striking things, though, is if you fly over the land or if you operate a device, which allows you to see these particular sites, you'll notice that a lot of them are constructed on hills and in the mountains and in very remote areas. Now take yourself back to the time as we understand it from the mainstream official historical account. How exactly would one go about walking up these great hills and these mountains building these structures? How exactly would one continue building the wonderful cathedral that we see here? Now, of course, this is another example of the Gaudi architecture, a very unique anomaly here with the Sagrada Familia Cathedral. What's really the origin behind it? Well, we're informed that a portion of it was constructed in the 1800s, and it's been under continuous construction since, even to this day. But then you also have the legacy of the old fortifications, what we refer to as star forts, or geometrically precise foundation structures. And there are so many examples of these across the Iberian Peninsula. You even have numerous fountains that are located all over, with different structures and statues affiliated with them. What exactly are they really constructed out of? Because I'm always impressed by the fact that we have accounts that these structures have been here for hundreds of years, and if true, how is it that they're still standing? Because one thing you tend not to have are numerous images and accounts of constant renovations. And it seems as though, for whatever reason, the lands of Iberia have not been hit by the need for urban renewal. There's also the incredible open landscape that you can find, the mountains and the mountain passes. And when you take different looks at different perspectives, you can see this mixing of structures. You can see these grand cathedrals and monasteries with their great towers and domes, and they're all over the place. And perhaps that's one of the most dramatic presentations of the land of Iberia. And you could also find the mixing of what we might consider our current civilization on top of the previous civilizations. And whatever your perspective on history is, you certainly have to understand that these are dramatic structures, that these are genuine and authentic structures, made out of materials that still endure to this day. And whichever particular incredible castle or monastery that you're looking at in its very isolated and remote location, you find yourself struggling to really explain how it was done from that logistical means. Any overview of any city will give you numerous examples of palaces, cathedrals, municipal buildings, and every other example that we have. So much architecture that for whatever reason continues to endure in the Iberian Peninsula to this day, and all within easy traveling distance. Well, let's take a look at the star forts, or as I like to call the geometrically precise foundation structures. Yes, perhaps I lament coming up with that term. But when we look at Portugal on our wonderful star fort map, we see that there are many examples of star forts, oddly enough, out in the open land. So some people have suggested in the comments that they were constructed to resist the attacks of pirates. Although these ones out in the open landscape, some of the most dramatic examples of star forts that we have, were certainly not constructed to resist pirates, unless of course they were going for a long walk. And if you ever played the original Pirate Simulator game from the 1990s, you'll know that when you're pirates and you're out walking around, it's not a lot of fun. But to be serious though, we see some of the most exact and amazing geometrically precise foundation structures. Are these really just fortifications, or are they representing something else entirely? Because many of these still exist in the middle of cities. Well, you could simply say that it's merely a citadel, it's merely a fortress complex. It was so they could defend the city from all the invaders who were coming from every direction, not just the sea. And yet when I look, every time I see these geometrically precise foundation structures, these star forts, I'm always led to the impression that there's a very different origin story behind them. And we could look at some of the ones that are near the ocean or near the sea, and perhaps we can accept that explanation that they were constructed, facing towards the land, to resist the attacks of those from the sea. Or perhaps they represent some sort of technology, some sort of mighty apparatus that was much more complex and much more extensive than we can begin to imagine. And many people simply say, you need to stop using your imagination. It's well documented that it was used for defensive purposes and defensive fortifications. And maybe so. We look at one of the most dramatic examples, Conde de Lippe Fort, founded 1763, and one of the most elaborate and exotic constructions of a star fort that still endures to this day. And if you actually explore this on the ground and from the air, you'll see that there are many examples of geometric precision within this particular structure that defy the ability to explain. Explain easily in terms of how this was actually constructed. How is this amazing structure put together from the start? Because looking at it from different perspectives, you can see that not only does it have the layering behind it, but it also has the geometric precision that indicates that it's not necessarily for defensive purposes from the inside. Now, if star forts were so impenetrable, if they were merely the invention of a French engineer, which somehow this esoteric knowledge again passed across the land, all the architects knew how to do it, there were contractors everywhere, or, as we're informed, they could simply find serfs or peasants or free people who were experts in architectural construction at that time. Whatever the explanation may be, and it varies depending on what land you're in, how was it that they were able to construct these elaborate and complex structures? And the question that I'll pose to you as we look at this most elaborate and most complex of star forts: could anyone, anywhere, construct something like this today? And if you really believe that they could, what are the means that it could be done? Would we simply mine these particular structures, mine the materials, and then haul them to where they needed to be? And when you look at certain perspectives, we, oddly enough, have continuous structures. In other words, there oftentimes does not seem to be the sign of smaller blocks. Now, it's not to say that they aren't there, but from any perspective, it does give the impression that there is a more advanced construction knowledge than might initially meet the eye. There might be something that we've lost over time, and there might have been something that we're not aware of that also exists within these structures. Perhaps a completely different application of technology that eludes us. Because when you look at this one structure, and we're only looking at one right now, you have the indication that there are many different functions of technology that could possibly be beyond our ability to comprehend. Could it include the ability to actually bring power out of the natural land, or even the air? Could it also include other means of how the actual blocks were put together? Officially, we're informed that these were all Masonic constructions, or in other words, they were stone masonry. And yet that word oftentimes has a lot of play with it. But what's it really mean? Well, in simple terms, they mined the stones from some quarry, hauled them to this remote location, and then reassembled them in this very elaborate and geometrical pattern, because it was an impenetrable defensive position. Now, of course, any land army could very easily bypass this, because there aren't other star forts that are in what's called mutually supporting distance. Now, of course, someone would say you couldn't simply bypass it, because then your lines of logistics would be exposed. But in military doctrine, it's called a turning movement. A turning movement is when you bypass a fixed fortification, and you're attempting to force or compel the defending force to leave the fixed fortification, which is where the statement comes from, fixed fortifications are a monument to the stupidity of humanity. But I'm under the impression that this is so much more than just a fixed fortification, that it was originally built with much greater intentions in mind. Could it have been simply one small piece of a much greater apparatus of technology that encompassed more of the land than we could begin to imagine? Think of all these star forts that we have, and I'll attach a link for the star fort map in the video description, and you can do your own analysis to see all the different surviving and documented star forts. And keep in mind that that list in that map is not all inclusive. There's always more that we're finding every day. We also have the old and original maps of the cities across the land that show that they seem to have been constructed on a star fort. Now, is this definitive evidence? No. But is this yet another clue that there's something much more than meets the eye behind these structures? It certainly is. Now, if you want to accept these clues as the possibility that there's something more elaborate going on, you can, or you can simply maintain your perspective with the official historical account. It's up to you. And then we have the monasteries, or as I like to call them, RPC. Yes, I'm inventing another term. RPC, Reset Preservation Center. And that's what I suspect or theorize that a lot of these monasteries really are. Reset preservation centers, because how else do you explain their very remote location? Now, we're informed that the monasteries were constructed in remote locations, so the individuals that attended monasteries, the monks and the other staff or whoever, they could actually isolate themselves from society to live the ascetic, yes, so much wordplay there, lifestyle. How difficult would it have been, with our understanding of the historical account, to construct this particular monastery that we look at, isolated in the mountains? Are we to believe that a handful of monks managed to pull this off themselves? And, of course, we're informed in the official historical account that priests and bishops were also expert architects in their spare time. That, yes, these monks really could pull off these logistical impossibilities. We look at Batala Monastery in Portugal, a UNESCO site, of course, built 1386 to 1517, or thereabouts, because once again it's another hand wave time, because how exactly do we know specifically? And you'll find one of the most elaborate and detailed and exotic sites here in what's supposed to be a monastery. An incredible cathedral or a basilica or all the other names that we have for religious structures. And this particular one being one of the most dramatic and one of the most incredible. It should also be noted that this contains several portals that we'll take a look at in a moment. Yes, they call the entryways portals. You'll also see the examples of the more elaborate, what is traditionally referred to as Gothic architecture. And oftentimes I find the names for architecture to simply be placeholders. Is it possible that what we're looking at is the remains of technology? Another technology that again had the ability for power generation. And again, we have older drawings, older renderings, older paintings, or whatever you want to call them, images that indicate that this incredible monastery has been with us for quite a period of time. I also find the entire account of a structure being constructed over decades or hundreds of years somewhat problematic. Because when you look closer at this incredible monastery in Portugal, you'll see some of the most detailed decorations that you could ever begin to imagine on this incredible portal door. Someone once told me in the comments the reason they had large portal doors was so they could move armies through these doors for presentations and parades and to actually defend these structures. But officially, this was never a military structure. This is merely a monastery built for religious purposes. So why exactly would that necessitate these incredible portal doors with the beautiful arches and the decorations behind them? Why exactly would it warrant the commitment of such resources and such difficulty? And again, I ask the question, could anybody build a structure like this today? And I'm not even just talking about a single city or a nation. Could a group of nations do it if they pooled all their resources, took all the greatest advances of technology, used our incredible artificial intelligence, and had individuals who are very financially well off? Because when we go back to the original account of the aqueduct in Portugal, we're not informed that King Yao V financed it out of his own pocket. He had to raise a sales tax to do it. Where exactly did the money come from to build this elaborate monastery? Did they place a sales tax on the monks that were going to live there? And those are the kind of intellectual cheetah flips that you have to engage in if you're going to just accept the official historical account. Or the other way you could accept it is just simply not to apply any critical thinking and accept everything you're told. You look at the older images, though, of this monastery, and again, you're given the impression that this structure is far older than we can begin to imagine. Is it just a few hundred years old, or is it even older than that? And yet, despite the fact that it's so incredibly old, something about it appears so incredibly advanced. And no matter what people tell you, and whatever preconceived notions you have, if you go and you visit this and look at it from the ground, you'll also see that there are many details about it that defy the ability to explain, even in modern construction techniques. Now, of course, someone will tell you, yes, we could do this if we were so inclined. We just don't have the money now. And I always find that explanation so enjoyable. I always appreciate the explanation, though, of money because we seem to think, or we've been inclined to think, that if we just have any amount of money, we can achieve anything. But you can find no shortage of very recent modern examples that no amount of money can simply achieve anything. And perhaps one of the most famous examples is just to look at the United States adventures in the Middle East and all the money that was expended in places such as Iraq and Afghanistan. And did the United States come to achieving its strategic objectives? Well, some would debate on that, but why were they there so long? And what did they ultimately achieve? Because I use that example because we're talking about trillions of dollars. And the question I have is, could trillions of dollars committed actually build a structure like this today? You need more than money. You need to actually have the knowledge. And defenders of the mainstream account will simply say that, yes, they had the knowledge. There were expert craftsmen everywhere to be found. In Spain and Portugal, back in the 13, 14, and 1500s, you apparently didn't have to provide them with any water or food, and if you just had animal power, that answers the logistics, the questions that are never answered. And then with the knowledge of craftspeople, you could actually achieve this. And perhaps they taxed the people in the local villages, and they imposed a sales tax on the monks that were actually going to inhabit this monastery. And that's how we can easily explain without question how this incredible edifice was constructed over 100 years with all the beautiful ornate detail. Oh, it should also be noted that it was constructed to survive to this very day. And now as we gaze upon the incredible and ornately decorated portals, and why exactly are they called portals? Well, there's many different explanations and theories for why they oftentimes use the explanation of portals for a structure such as this. Now again, you can simply say it's because it's a matter of religious piety, and perhaps they were paying tribute to that. You take a look, though, at this monastery, and I'm usually not a fan of using Google Earth. At least I don't prefer to do that kind of exploration on my channel, and I'm not criticizing other explorers who do. It's just not something that works well for me. But I'm making an exception in this particular case because I believe you can get a good idea of what the structure actually looks like. You can also see some of the fine geometric precision looking at it from the air. And I also wanted to take some time to really look at it on the ground with you because I do recall being on the ground looking at the structure, but at the time I didn't have a cell phone. Nobody had a cell phone at this particular time. Everybody that was there just simply appreciated the structure. Now, I'm not criticizing the use of cell phones or anything like that, at least not in this exploration, but I'm using this to show you exactly what this structure looks like from the ground. Because not only is the structure itself very impressive, but the surrounding foundation, the very blocks that it's constructed on, are very impressive. And again, you have this almost conflicting visual of at what point in time a lot of these blocks were actually brought in. How was this construction really done? Now, if you accept the mainstream historical account, you have to ask, how exactly were each of these towers, how was every little spire constructed? Was it carved? Was it formed? Was it poured into place? Well, if we go with the latter explanations, how exactly was that pulled off from the mid-1300s to the early 1500s? How exactly did they achieve such fine geometric precision even from the air? And here you can kind of see how the actual pad that it was constructed on, I'll just call it that, I know that's a little bit of a generic term, but also the surrounding grounds. There's even geometric precision in the surrounding grounds. And it looks like we even have a little bit of a sewer area here, or at least a drainage area. So again, it gives the impression that there's something much more advanced about this particular structure than we can begin to imagine. And even looking in the interior courtyard, you can see the many examples of the arches and the beauty that persist to this day. How old is this structure really? How exactly were these towers constructed? How was the detail in every single arch constructed at that time as well? Because we're going back to the 13 to the 1400s. This is a time we're informed that the vast majority of the population was illiterate, that they were isolated, and that they were living in seclusion, at least seclusion from the rest of society. And yet somehow they managed to find people who were experts to pull off all of this detailed construction. How many monks would it have taken to actually just build a single one of these spires? And again, asking the question, how would they have done it? Now you might think this is merely a repetitive form of questioning, but since things are told to us in a repetitive fashion, yes, they did it, yes, they did it, yes, they did it, then I respond by saying, how did they do it? How did they do it? How did they do it? And I don't think I've ever gotten a good explanation behind it. Now I know there'll be people in the comments that'll respond with emotionalism, as there usually is, that you should not be questioning the great European history, that that's absurd. Of course, I question all history. I'm not confined to a particular geographical area. And yet you see some of the unbelievable precision, some of the beauty, just looking at the fine details within the structure. And if you do have the means, or if you are going on a trip in Portugal, or if you live there, I strongly recommend visiting this site. There's also other feelings, other inclinations you'll have while you're actually on site at this particular monastery. You could certainly understand why some would say that it has a profound religious effect on people. And the only reason that I decided to actually use a little bit of a Google Earth exploration is I wanted to try to convey that sense to you. If you don't have the means to get there, I wanted to try to share that with you. And by all means, on your own, look into the official history behind this incredible monastery. Try to find out exactly how they constructed it. Because much like the castle and numerous other castles, numerous other palaces, there are so many large details that are missing. And again, when you go outside of the structure and you look at the actual blocks that it's built on, I mean, let's just question that. There's also this impressive statue out in front of it. And yet again, it reflects the individual who had won another military victory that we're celebrating, and that was what prompted the construction of this monastery. Yes, there was a time when the state supported the initiatives of the church, and that's another way that we explain this. Again, it was all in the unified bout of piety. Some people simply say that divine beings constructed all these structures, and that's the explanation. I certainly can't discount it, because I did not witness the structure being constructed firsthand. So right now, my mind is open to every single explanation. Yes, to include the mainstream historical account. But I just assign different possibilities, different likelihoods of each account actually being true. And right now, I believe that the actual account that we have, the real way that these structures were built and pulled off, is something that eludes us currently. And even looking at the other walkways and the other areas that are around this impressive structure, and again, the other portal door in the tower, are we again to really just simply accept that this was all done in the 13 to the 1500s? Well, you're insulting our ancestors if you suggest that. No, I'm not insulting anybody. I believe that somebody did really build this, but the question is who? And what techniques and what knowledges were lost to us over time? And yes, I say knowledges because you're talking about many different forms of knowledge. You're not just talking about the actual construction techniques, you're also talking about the advanced logistics that went into constructing such a structure like this. How exactly were these blocks moved? Or how exactly were these construction materials moved? And what is really the composition of this structure? Are we really to believe that this is just taken from the rocks as is? Or is there something more advanced in the actual composition of the materials? Is that why there's so many different colors and different forms of what we may think of as discoloration? And yet it should be credited to the fact that this structure still stands, that it still has the structural integrity that oftentimes eludes many of the modern structures that we have to this day. Maybe you want to stand there and tell me that a glass and steel tower is going to stand for 500 years, and maybe you might believe that it will. And who knows, maybe it actually will. I guess we'll find out. But something tells me you're never going to see the examples and the details that you see in this one particular monastery. And keep in mind, we're only looking at one single monastery here. There are many monasteries to be found, many castles, many complexes, many palaces across the Iberian Peninsula. And now we look at the definitive sanctuary of Our Lady of Good Remedy, the Stairway of Heaven, built 1750 to 1900. Now I ask you, compare this to the monastery that we just looked at. Is there really any visual difference between what was constructed in 1750 to 1900 as opposed to what was constructed from 1350 to 1500 or thereabouts, circa as the time frame's given? I oftentimes poke fun at the chronology, and the reason I do that is we think that we have this very confident framework of the years that preceded us. And perhaps we do. But how much of that is simply accomplished by overlapping chronologies? And indeed, if you read what is from the Star Wars Legends series and the original Admiral Thrawn trilogy of books, or Heir to the Empire, you have Luke Skywalker lamenting the fact that every time a new civilization, a new government even, takes power, that it imposes a new chronology, the imperial date, or in the year of the Republic. Is that exactly what's happened with us? Is that what we're really looking at here? Because we know that we have different dating systems. And yet, looking at this sanctuary, as it's called today, we'll see, again, more examples of impressive and stunning architecture. So this was constructed 1750 to 1900, the official historical account says. And again, you'll see some of the most elaborate and incredible forms of architectural beauty. And again, people just simply hand wave it away and say, just because something looks artistically beautiful doesn't mean that it's a sign of an advanced civilization. Perhaps not. And you'll also find a similarly named site in Mexico, the exact same kind of sanctuary. And indeed, you'll find many sites that are reflected across oceans that look exactly the same as the sites in the Iberian Peninsula. And indeed, that's what prompted this exploration. Now, are we to think that the great Spanish and the Portuguese sailors managed to transmit the knowledge with them, and that they managed to convey it to the forced labor that they used on site as part of the encomienda, and that's how they managed to replicate these great structures across South America, Central America, and even what is now the United States? Or is there an entirely different explanation? Looking at this incredible site, this Stairway to Heaven in Portugal, I'm inclined to think that there's a much different explanation than the ones that we've been given. You can even find that not only do you have the architectural beauty here, there's even a more elaborate art that's put on top of these stones. Now, is this more recent? If it is more recent, though, it is reflecting a greater beauty than we tend to see, and it's not a mosaic. And one of the great physical challenges I'll give you if you go to the site in person is walk up and down these stairs. You might recall during the Kansas City exploration, I was lamenting walking up and down all the stairs at Liberty Tower on the hottest day of the year. Well, go to this particular site on the hottest day of year and walk all the way up and down the stairs. And let me assure you, there's a lot of different stairs on this particular site. Numerous obelisks, numerous banisters, all made out of some very advanced construction material. Is it just simply concrete? Well, maybe you can accept that. But you see the very impressive and unique designs. And once again, we also see the same symbols that we see across the land. And what exactly do those symbols actually represent? Well, join us on the live stream. We're going to be taking another look at what these symbols could possibly represent. And again, no shortage of obelisks with stars on top of them. And what exactly do they refer to? These aren't exactly the symbols that we'd expect to see in Portugal in the 1750s, the 1900s. Now, maybe somebody out there will argue that, yes, it's very well documented that there was a small group of people that actually wanted to showcase these symbols, that this makes sense within the context of the Catholic religion at that time. or whatever religion we say was actually in power or had influence during that particular time. One little interesting point I'll share about all the power and prestige of the Catholic religion, especially in the 1800s, we're informed that during the 1800s the papacy was in decline, and that the Kingdom of Italy was seizing their lands, and indeed completed that process. And it wasn't until the late 1920s that there was even papal lands that were recognized. That's if we take the historical value, or rather we take the historical account at face value. Looking at this obelisk though, look at some of the details that you see in here. And what exactly is this sun figure supposed to represent? Even looking on the structure itself, you'll see that there are fine details. Many different window adornments, many different portal windows, and even clocks on this. Why exactly would anybody put all this kind of effort into constructing this in 1750 to 1900? Weren't there other concerns that were going on at that time? And yet when you actually walk on the structure, you might find some blocks that seem to have been added later. Now, I'm not suggesting that's the case, but even mainstream history confirms that many of these blocks were added later. That oftentimes these structures are the subject to numerous renovations. And if it wasn't for the intervention of these renovations, that these structures would just fall apart. For this particular sanctuary, there is also the presence of very old trees, and oftentimes I overlook the presence of the flora and the foliage that tend to be around these particular structures. And what's really impressive about this is this might be indicative of the fact that these structures are, again, far older than we could begin to imagine. How old are these trees? And you do have the presence of some very old and impressive trees that are around this particular structure. Now, I don't know, I didn't personally analyze these trees while I was there. In fact, I didn't even think of it at the time while I was there. I'm merely mentioning it to you that if you do go and visit, that you think about such things and try to impose your own analysis on it. There's no absolute right or wrong, and a lot of times people will try to convince you that there is an absolute right or wrong, and they'll do so on the most flimsy of evidence possible. There's even people that'll go out of their way to criticize or castigate you for just simply thinking about things. Why is it wrong to think about things? Well, it's wrong to think about things if someone doesn't want you to think about things. You should just accept what you're told. And you certainly have the option to do that. But if you actually approach every single location, wherever you are in the land, with an open mind, and you really think about how it was constructed, you might not know the answers, but you'll certainly find personal enlightenment in the search in and of itself. You'll also truly appreciate the full glory that all these sites really have. And regardless of who is really responsible for their construction, regardless of the actual history or the truth, and we oftentimes like to bandy about that word, I am a purveyor of the truth. I certainly don't ever say that. And I never say that I'm a purveyor of the truth. And you know why I don't? Because I did not personally witness any of these structures being constructed. I do not know. I leave it for you to analyze and assess on your own. And I'm not going to criticize or castigate or humiliate you because you want to embrace a different perspective on it. If you want to embrace the mainstream perspective, that's completely fine. If you believe that having star forts out there on the coastline, and that's what justifies you cosplaying as a pirate, that's completely your discretion. And I have no issue with that. In fact, I appreciate people who use creativity and imagination. But perhaps one of the most impressive and dramatic things when we do these explorations that we tend to see, we have to think about what's the origin of these structures. We're informed that these little marks that you have on these blocks were simply done by those that constructed it as some sort of marking system. Is that really what happened? Because unless you actually witnessed it, how can you actually know what happened? Yes, you have a recorded historical account. Recorded by whom exactly? Sometimes we know, most times we don't. And if you do go to Portugal, I strongly recommend you visit this sanctuary, that you walk all these stairs and really go through the experience of what it must be. Just think on how difficult it is to walk this structure. Imagine how difficult it was to construct it, even if this was constructed today, now, with all the modern implementations of technology we have, with our artificial intelligence, with our hydraulics and heavy machinery, with our developed logistics systems, our incredible roads, our motorized and mechanized transportation. We have no limits on what we can do to this day. And yet I would argue that there is no one anywhere, no compilation of organizations and nations that could pull off a structure like this today. Perhaps we could pull off some sort of replication of it, but you could tell it's not authentic, at least not what came before. But what are your thoughts? Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Coney Island, a land of many different mysteries that go all the way back to, you'll never guess it, the 1800s. And we can see now that it's beset by modern functional architecture. But if you get on a subway in New York and you're on your way to Coney Island, you may come across some of these mysteries. For example, the geographical position of Coney Island, which just happens to be located right in the narrows between Upper and Lower New York Bay. Whatever name we're referring to the bay by, though, it's very intriguing to think that Coney Island happens to be at the main point of entry. And we understand that New York City was the first true megalopolis in the United States. And here you can see the exact position of Coney Island right before the narrows between Upper New York Bay and Lower New York Bay. So you can see it would be the main point of access. But there's many mysteries, such as these incredible amusement parks and very unique architecture. Was it temporary architecture? Or was there something more applicable about this Dragon Gorge area? And who is this real estate developer who tried to save Steeplechase Park? And is this actually a Stargate, a power generator, or something else? And we also had an incubator baby exhibit at Coney Island, one of the most famous ones. So all these different mysteries in this land of where a reset seems to have occurred, which could have been one of the significant starting points, as we have New York City as the first main population center in the United States. Join me as we explore these mysteries of Coney Island, the old world playground. Port of entry, post-reset 18-year unknown. Why would we say that Coney Island is a port of entry? And what would that really mean? Looking at Coney Island today, we can see that it's been through many of the modernizations or urban renewal efforts of the 1960s. And indeed, that rather familiar-looking real estate developer we saw in the intro, we'll look into his account of how he tried to renew and reinvigorate this particular area in the 1960s. But what's really the official historical account that we have with Coney Island, and why is it significant? Well, we understand that its positioning is right in the area between Upper New York Bay and Lower New York Bay. And of course, I jest about the various names that we have for all of our bodies of water because they always seem to be changing, much like we change other names. I'm not going to say anything about military bases in the United States. But we can see here that Coney Island is a part of Brooklyn, and that it divides Upper New York Bay and Lower New York Bay. So all of the main shipping coming from the Atlantic had to go by or pass by Coney Island, positioned right here. Now really think on this. Was this actually an original port of entry? We understand that Ellis Island and the area leading into New York City was really the port of entry into the United States. Or was there some other story that we have? A different account of Coney Island? Now, there are different maps that show us that it was originally a series of islands, as it runs all the way out to Long Island. There's also different stories or historical records that indicate that the very first cities, indeed Gravesend just north of Coney Island, or the next neighborhood over in Brooklyn, which is what Coney Island and Gravesend are part of, were the original settlements of the Dutch in what is today New York Harbor. But that's the official historical account. Ah yes, Gravesend. Very intriguing, isn't it, that we have a little steeple church that marked an entire town. Of course, those are the kinds of anomalies that you have when you look at the original maps. And is there something significant about Gravesend? Is there something significant about this overall existence of the way that these settlements come together? And indeed, the way that Coney Island and Long Island was stated to be different islands. Now, development, changes in the environment, did it actually cause all of these different pieces of land to become amalgamated, or was there something else that occurred? Looking at the bird's eye view of Coney Island, which we have, and for those of you who aren't familiar, Coney Island became an amusement park. And the stated reason for this was because it was accessible to many people looking to get away from the vast tenements in New York City or Manhattan Island in the 1880s and onward. And it led to the development of these amusement parks. Although the three great amusement parks that made up Coney Island were all constructed from 1890 to 1910. Ah yes, a very puzzling 20-year time period. And looking at the bird's eye view, we can see here, zooming in on Steeplechase Park, which was one of the main parks, we see the very puzzling architecture and also some of the fun rides. Now, were these really roller coasters, or could they have represented something else? Perhaps a larger apparatus, thinking outside the box a little bit. Looking at Luna Park, we see that it has a large tower in the middle of it, the second of the great parks. And interestingly enough, as we look at these parks, we see that they seem to become even greater in grandeur. As we go to Dreamland, what a very fitting name for an amusement park that has a large 300-foot tower in the middle of it. Well, I guess back during those times, you needed a large 300-foot tower to complete your amusement park experience. Now, officially, the racetrack being present, and this was horse racing, make no mistakes about it, as this was 1890 to 1910, was very critical for bringing people into the area. And then when they banned horse racing, well, that's what caused horse racing to move to Kentucky, so the official story goes. We also have another well-developed neighborhood here in Coney Island. And looking at the array of images and postcards that we have, we see the entire concept of amusement being played out. Now, let's think about this. Amusement, an active pursuit. What the defenders of the mainstream narrative oftentimes tell us, or mainstream account, or the actual history, however you want to refer to it as, is that people worked very, very hard in the 1800s and even the early 1900s. They worked long days, and the official history tells us that amusement was not an active pursuit. They really tell us that prior to the establishment of amusement parks and so on and so forth in the early 1900s, people conducted amusement as sort of a reactionary thing, or just very much they didn't have it planned in their day. Whereas now that you've built these incredible amusement parks, suddenly amusement and seeking recreation became an active pursuit. Now, is that really the way it always was, or is that just simply what we're being informed? Because when you look closely at some of this imagery, whether it's the actual photographs, and of course we always have the issue with the photographs, are they fully accurate or aren't they? They're clues, or the postcards. We do get many indications that these incredible amusement parks, the three that we went over, were very elaborate. And indeed, we ask that question, why exactly was a giant, well-lit tower, which we'll look closely at here in a second, necessary to convey the amusement in Coney Island, or these parks? And oddly enough, these parks, when you look at the official account, here we have the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea at Luna Park, because Jules Verne was the well-known quote-unquote science fiction author of the time. And so why wouldn't you have a vast amusement park? And keep in mind, this is in the very early 1900s, before we had these numerous film adaptations, including the famous one with Kirk Douglas with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But of course we have a wonderful display and a ride that you could really go on. I mean, whatever you want to call it. And of course it's filled with very elaborate and impressive architecture. To include our favorite cartouche symbol. Ah yes, we had to ensure that we built our favorite cartouche symbol all over these structures. And if you pay attention, you'll see that there are numerous details that show us unique symbols that are arrayed all over these particular parks. Now look at this particular tower. This isn't exactly the kind of design that you'd see. Now, I understand that people will say or think that perhaps these structures were made out of very cheap or temporary material, as amusement parks tend to be. And there are some indications of that when we look at the images. But there are other indications that show us that these were constructed out of more permanent materials, or something that was designed to last. Now, you may be asking, what exactly happened to Coney Island? And I'm sure you'll never guess it because, it's a story or a historical record that we've never come across before. Destruction by either natural disaster or fire. I'm sure you can guess where the story is already going. But before we get to that, really look at some of these structures and appreciate the detailing that went into them. And let's be considerate here. Let's just suppose that these structures really are all made out of temporary material, whether we want to call it stucco, plaster, or staff. The variations that we have. I'm always interested in the fact that we have wonderfully designated temporary materials. It's interesting to me that even with temporary materials, we were able to construct and put this kind of effort into this sort of detailing. as though we had to make the park incredibly beautiful. And yet our amusement parks to this day certainly don't match this in any way, shape, or form. Now, is that to say that necessarily proves anything? No. We can certainly go with the understood historical comprehension of what the society was like at this time, that yes, people did work harder, and yes, they did put more artistic effort into their constructions. But keep in mind, where exactly does that inspiration come from if these people really are working all the time? And indeed, that's the understanding that we have, is that recreation, amusement, was not an active pursuit in the 1800s. It was something that developed later. But the issue is, if the mind is never allowed to be idle, then you're never allowed to inspire. And are we really looking at an apparatus of lost technology? Is that really what these amusement parks are? The location and the position of Coney Island is no coincidence. And keep in mind that New York, considered to be the greatest natural harbor in the world, you could understand why this could be a large port of entry. Were these structures built out of temporary appearing materials? Or were these structures already there? Or is there some other explanation? And you can see that there was a grand procession of many great activities and displays, spectacles that accompanied these incredible structures. And you could see why Coney Island was referred to as the amusement park of the world, or as we're referring to it in this particular exploration, the playground of the old world. And that was the actual sobriquet of it, playground of the world. Ah, yes, this incredible globe tower. Apparently an architect in the very early 1900s had this concept to build this very impressive and unique edifice, a vertical display of an amusement park, if you will. But not just a display, a practical application. A globe tower that was actually an amusement park in and of itself. Now again, the official history tells us that this impressive structure was never completed. But if this was beyond the means at the time, then why would anybody come up with this particular design? And looking more closely, you can just see how elaborate and exquisite this impressive edifice was, even in concept. This is something from a science fiction movie. And indeed, the gargantuan size of it seems to defy the implements that were available at the time. Now, did this only exist in concept? Or is it possible that this was also another remaining structure that was at Coney Island that was torn down over time? Well, of course, people say that's merely the realm of speculation and a wild imagination. Maybe so. But there are many other structures and details when you look closely at the images that we have of the three amusement parks in their heyday at Coney Island, which, by the way, was only from the late 1890s to 1911. And after that, unfortunately, we already began to lose many of these great structures in Coney Island, with a series of fires that beset the parks. Ah, yes, this definitely encourages the saying that the devil's in the details. And again, looking closely at some of the architecture, we have hints that there are more prevailing, more enduring construction materials that were utilized in the construction of these impressive edifices. Now, this particular impressive tower in Dreamland, which is over 300 feet. Now, this tower no longer stands, so we don't have a way to verify it. We can't assess and analyze the construction materials, unfortunately. But I'm reminded of the great, wonderful areas that we've seen across the United States that still endure to this day that are somewhat mystifying, such as the plaza in Kansas City. And look at all the effort that went into the construction of this creation display, or this creation attraction, whatever you want to call it. I have to say, there are certain details in this that seem to go way beyond what we see in modern-day Disneyland or Disney World. Perhaps we'll have to do an exploration of Lucius Aurelian's adventure to Disneyland. It's a great story. But looking closely here, we see the architectural detail of columns amalgamated into the walls again. And even looking at the older imagery of the amusement parks on Coney Island, we see some rather bizarre curiosities. Apparently this large elephant was a hotel. Now again, I don't know. I wasn't there. I'm just looking at an image and reading accounts, as are the rest of you. Now, we can accept these official historical accounts or these records, or we can question them. Because remember, historians are not the ones who are charged with actually keeping records in the moment. Who actually does that? Well, oftentimes we rely on the media. The issue with that, though, is that from official sources, the media or journalists are not qualified to ascertain the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. Only certified historians and scientists can do that. So the people who actually keep the records are not the people who are certified to determine the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. Does anybody ever really question that? No, probably not. But looking at some of these other images here of Luna Park and looking in the background, we do see some very interesting architecture. And the detailing that went into this, the effort that went into really creating this fairy tale land. Perhaps we can accept the fact that there was a time when people who had never actively pursued amusement just decided on a whim to invest all this time, all this effort, and all these resources into doing something that had never been done before, for a people whose lifestyle had never been suited to actively seeking amusement. I mean, really think about this. What actually compelled people to go to Coney Island, Long Island? Well, we'll be informed that because New York City was getting oppressed with all the close construction and the various tenements in the 1800s, people were seeking escape from the hot summers. So they decided to go down here to the beach, watch the elephants go on by, and appreciate this very incredible, elaborate architecture. Remember, these were people who were informed worked all the time, and their sole purpose in life was to work, and that recreation or amusement was merely a byproduct of the day. And if you remember watching some of those old historical films about the 1800s, about the couple on the farm, you might recall that the highlight of their amusement was the husband falling off the ladder and landing on his butt, and his wife laughing at him. And that was the highlight of their amusement. So we're supposed to reconcile that. Now, yes, I understand that is a historical record or a perception that people were inflicting on us from people from the 1800s, who of course we don't know and we've never talked to. Why would you go to all this effort to build and put all these resources into establishing these incredible amusement parks? Now, we understand that it was just a simple series of rides, one of the original gravity roller coasters in the 1880s, and then as time went on, they just decided to build these very impressive and incredible amusement parks, earning the sobriquet of Coney Island being the playground of the world. But is that really what it was? Or had it been the fact that there really was the remnants of all this incredible architecture, either from another civilization, an overlapping timeline, or some other explanation? I'm always willing to accept the fact that the historical account could be correct, but when you try to reconcile it and make it work, there always tends to be so many issues. Every answer creates 3 or 4 more questions, and you're always trying to understand that during this time, the late 1800s, was when the United States was still expanding westward. The resources that were still going into expanding westward. You also have to take into account the fact that there were numerous economic issues, the Great Depression before the Great Depression in the 1870s, and all the panics that ultimately warranted a complete overhaul of the U.S. economic system, the establishment of a central bank, and the imposition of federal income tax. Here is a sketch of that original gravity coaster, and that's all we have of it. You also have this interesting display or series of attractions that promote disasters, such as this Johnstown flood. Now, I don't know if that's really what this is about, and this is a very interesting structure in and of itself as well. It's a pity it's not still standing, and it could well just be some sort of temporary material. But I have to ask the question that with these turrets and these large towers of this castle appearance, is it possible that there may have been a very different explanation? There's also the interesting concept of exhibition that's displayed here in Coney Island. And indeed, the one of the 3 amusement parks that lasted the longest to the 1960s, Steeplechase, and that was because of revival efforts, they actually had large forums like this that seemed to do displays much as we've seen in the World's Fairs. So again, we have to ask those hard questions. Is Coney Island originally just a series of amusement parks? Or did it have a series of different functions, much in the same way that the World's Fairs or exhibitions did? Not only was this a port of entry, if you will, for the people coming in to settle these lands that have just recently been surveyed, after the last reset, it's also a place where the new society is going to be learned and understood by these people. Because remember, the hot dog that was developed in Coney Island and sold at Coney Island. And what exactly is going on in all these displays? What are they really representing? Because oftentimes we see different symbols and we see different displays that we don't have a common understanding was in the minds of the average American or whoever, because we also understand that there were many immigrants that were coming into the United States during this time frame, that these symbols would mean anything to them. Now, once again, defenders of the mainstream account will say that it's simply because everybody had this imagination and they brought in their myths and their legends from their homelands. Fair enough. But if that's really what happened, why is it we have all this reference to a time frame from the distant past? These pantheon of deities that we see were certainly not, as we understand it, in the mainstream religious collective in the 1800s. I mean, we didn't have some sort of movement to go back to the pagan deities of the Roman or Greek times, did we? And yet, for whatever reason, we see a lot of veneration and a lot of effort designed to construct the symbols. And why would anybody want to construct a tower like this in the middle of an amusement park? You would think that the resources, if you really were devoted to an amusement park, which, remember again, we're constructing for people who we understood did not pursue amusement actively. They only did it reactively. You're going to build a giant tower instead of roller coasters or other rides or other more cost-effective means to entertain people. I mean, I thought this was the United States, and we've always been about the pursuit of capitalism, building businesses, and making money. Now, whether we acquire that through people visiting our attractions or deriving the money from the land, the pursuit has always been to make money. But much like the World's Fairs, we understand there seemed to be a lot of money that was invested in a concept that had not been proven. And so it seems to be the contradiction there if we take money and finances at face value. Because people who typically have a lot of money are good at generating money, are good at saving it, and are good at creating more money. At least that's what we understand it. But we're supposed to accept that these people who were good at those things just suddenly decided in a bout of altruism, or all the other terms that we have for it, philanthropy, one of my favorites, that they were just going to share this with the people at the time. And indeed, that's what the official account says. Because these robber barons, these people who had made their fortunes, they wanted to be remembered fondly. And what better way to be remembered fondly than just by giving your money away? Investing your money, or really not investing it, let's be honest, you're not going to get a return on this because there was no return of positive net benefit from investing in the World's Fairs or Coney Island. Even though there were a lot of efforts to revive Coney Island. And no, those efforts didn't end after the series of fires that befell several of the parks. And there's even an account that these fires did strike. And we'll look at that very closely. But why would anybody put all of this effort and all of their resources, whether they were rich or not, because we also have to look at the fact that there were people who were hired to work here. There were people who lived in the area to make these amusement parks and to draw all these people there. And then it also comes to that old question, what came first? Did the people come first because they were seeking the beaches, or were the attractions already there and that drew the people out there? All interesting questions. Now, oddly enough, with the reactivation, or perhaps we should say with the development of transportation technology, that's the explanation that we have for people being able to commute from Manhattan Island down here to Brooklyn. And indeed, the area is connected, so perhaps that is an explanation. But looking at some of these awe-inspiring sights with the employment of electricity, and keep in mind, once again, this is in the very early 1900s. Once again, I'm amazed that we have another example of how we just seem to be able to adopt and adapt this brand new technology very efficiently and very quickly. Now, oddly enough, we look at all the long issues that we have with establishing technology now. You would think that we would be more proficient at it, but it seems as though we were more proficient at true revolutionary technology in the early 1900s than we are now. Well, perhaps the advent of more artificial intelligence will help with that. Looking at some of these postcards, though, you can see images that truly seem to convey some sort of fairy tale world, or dare I say, some sort of science fiction world. And perhaps that's the most striking drama that you have when you look at the images of Coney Island, and yet you pay attention to some of the details in the background. And so here's what we have. We have this location that leads into the entryway into New York City, in between the two major bays, which is considered one of the finest natural harbors in the world. We have numerous accounts of all these people coming through this area. Now, these aren't immigrants, these aren't people coming into New York City according to the official account, but these are people that are living in New York City that are looking for a good time and looking to get away from the island. The island being Manhattan. And of course, we have all the rides that are associated with Coney Island. And that's the other question that we have to ask. Were these rides really just that, simple rides of amusement? Or is it possible that these rides themselves were also a remnant of this previous technology, or this large apparatus that for some reason had survived the last reset, if we're going with that theory, on explaining these incredible structures that are at Coney Island? Because what we really have here is an amalgamation of impressive structures and impressive machines, all in a very confined geographical area. And oddly enough, we went to a lot of effort to very well document this to this day. Now think about your own experiences going to amusement parks and what you really go there to do and what it's really about. It's about having fun, trying not to wait in line, and maybe getting some food that's not too much overpriced. But you look at some of these other images that we have of the amusement parks at Coney Island, and you also reconcile that with the postcards that we have, and it gives you the clue that there really was something very elaborate and incredible. And I have to pose that hard question, did the Globe Tower really exist? And is it possible that there were even more amazing structures that remain? This particular image right here shows us the initial train station to enter this area, and yet looking at the walkway, it gives us the impression here that it's been there for a much longer period of time and that it wasn't just recently established just 10, 15, 20 years before this image was taken. Of course, this is another one of those images that, according to the archive, has about a 15-year circa range to it. So who really knows? That's always the issue when you're trying to do any sort of image analysis. But there are no shortage of images, and really consider the society of the people that are going to this amusement park. We always have these individuals that are very well dressed. Now we could just say that was the societal mores of the time. In the 1900s in the United States, especially around New York City, everybody dressed their very finest to go out and have a good time. Because remember, according to the official historical account, seeking amusement in an active pursuit was a new concept. And so I guess this gamble paid off. This gamble to build these structures and these amusements for these people that were all coming from Manhattan Island to get away from the heat in the summer. And that's why Coney Island was established as it was. And let's not forget that years later, when a young Tom Hanks would go diving off a boat and he would encounter a mermaid. And if you know what film I'm referring to there, please let me know. And no, I'm not going to show an image from it. Steeplechase is intriguing as well because it seems to have more of the exhibitionary concept behind it. And when you look in the details, perhaps you could understand or look for an explanation for why you have some of these very intriguing architectural anomalies that are here as part of this park. And of course, many electrical lines from what particular time frame? Was this early 1900s? Was this 1920s? Did this come later? Was the park powered? And indeed, are there other accounts of very unique architecture within this park? And even looking at the beach photo, and you may recall there's been numerous explorations in the past, and most prominently I can think of John Levi referring to looking at how people on the beach seem to be rather lost. No towels, no beachwear. In this particular image, purported to be from the 19-teens or the early 1920s, again another circa image, and yes, anybody can write any date on an image, we seem to see a little bit of an amalgamation here. We have some people that are well dressed and seem out of place, and others who seem to be starting to adapt to life at the beach. And so again, more clues within the photos. Is this just simply a carousel ride, Or is this ride and the power that provides it part of some other apparatus that was in existence at the time? And perhaps the story is most compelling with Coney Island because of the fact that there were so many people that were drawn to this particular area. And is it also possible that there really were more remnants here that had to be attended to over time? Because why exactly do you need very well decorated steeples and subsidiary towers on what's just supposed to be an amusement park or a display? Well, you need the stairs and the slide because it needs to look very decorative. Of course, nowadays we just do the very cheap plastic slide and we don't bother with the decorations. And the explanation for it is you don't have a helter-skelter like you did at Luna Park in the early 1900s because we're more efficient towards making money. Now, what happened to these incredible amusement parks in Coney Island? You'll never guess it. It's another story of legacy of fire. And in this case, we have magical dragon fire. This particular display that you're looking at, or this attraction, whatever you want to call it, is Dragon's Gorge. Another part of the Luna Park amusement attractions, and you can see that it's got the very impressive architecture with it, where you would actually go on a ride and you would go and see many different sights. And it featured a ride through a medieval fantasy land where you actually had dragons breathing fire. Kind of reminds me of the Dungeons & Dragons animated intro from the early 1980s. Apparently, though, these dragons really breathing fire, and there are accounts that they really did breathe fire, was not such a good idea. Because this is what caused numerous fires that ultimately burned down all of Luna Park. And there's numerous accounts of these dragons breathing fire. Ah, yes, another example of our favorite cartouche. Why do we need to build the cartouche on an amusement park ride or an attraction? Now, there is a patent for this Dragon's Gorge, interestingly enough, if you want to consider this very rudimentary sketch with some notes and figure number and then a number at the top of it, a patent. I don't know. Maybe I'm going to design a patent for Doc Brown's mind-reading device from the original Back to the Future movie. You know, I'll only need a single perspective, write some numbers on it, submit it to the patent office, and then I could actually have the patent for that. I'll be sure to call Robert Zemeckis to make sure he's okay with it. But all kidding aside, you think about the establishment of this ride, and then this led to a series of fires. And indeed, in the early 1900s, that's what Coney Island was known for, breaking out in fires all the time. Dreamland, the most impressive of the parks, went up in smoke in 1911. And Luna Park burned down several times, and then finally in the 1940s. Again attributed to that Dragon's Gorge attraction, where the dragons were actually breathing fire. So was this fire or was this magical fire? Where was Johnstown Flood? Yes, I'm mispronouncing that quite intentionally for fun. Why didn't they provide water or a flood that could have put out these flames? And it's intriguing to think that once again it's this account of having things that go up in fire. These impressive edifices, this very unique architecture, and indeed this amalgamation of many different mysteries that just quickly went up in smoke. And people will say, well, of course it's no mystery. We never figured out how to handle fires. And you look at some of the images of utter destruction and devastation of these amusement parks, and you'll see the same things that we've seen in many of the other images that we've looked at of city destruction across the land. Granted, the Great City Fires are attributed to a timeline that encompasses in some cases over 200 to 300 years, whether we're talking about the Great Fire in London in 1666, or we're talking about the Great Chicago Fire that occurred over 200 years later. Yet something about these events seem to be a little bit more contemporary and a little closer together than we might like to admit. Now again, you could say that's speculation, and you could say that the official timeline that we have is absolutely correct, and it's unimpeachable in questioning it. But when you start to notice certain consistencies, when you start to notice certain things that constantly repeat, whether it's the fires, whether it's the situation of destruction, whether it's the concept of urban renewal or tearing down to rebuild, there's certain patterns that seem to emerge that we can't ignore. And you look at some of the images here, and it really gives you an idea of just how extensive this destruction was, meaning how many structures there really were that were there. I appreciate this particular image because here in the bottom left corner it says, "The first duty of a city is to have a firehouse. Many cities, towns, and villages hesitate to make sufficient appropriation to properly supply their fire departments." And does this continue to be a situation to this day? And why does this continue to be a situation to this day where we struggle with fires? Whether it's a pinpoint fire on a single structure, or we're talking about a massive conflagration that destroys entire cities, amusement parks, or even whole sections of forests and vast landscapes that we just seem to be helpless to do anything about every single time. Very, very impressive structure in the background there, and also giving an idea of the size and immensity of these particular amusement parks prior to their destruction, of course. And why would we have all this rubbling and all this remaining debris if this was just indeed some temporary, cheap construction material? Now, it is possible, and granted, I didn't actually go there walking around the ruins myself to know for sure, but something else that's interesting to me is that we always seem to be able to very well document these fires when they happen and this destruction when it happens. You could also claim that there's more images of destruction than there are of the parks when they were at their functional heyday, and indeed that may be the case. But oddly enough, looking at this particular image, I'm overwhelmed by the fact that we would allow this destruction to continue. We seem to be aware of this, and yet, if we go off the official historical account, we've never seemed to be able to come up with an effective countermeasure to fires. Even with our awareness of it, and even with the advancements of our technology, whether it's our construction technology, our firefighting technology, or the ability to achieve proper command and control with first responders, we always seem to be at a loss whenever these fires occur. And whether it was the early 1900s or even last year, the situation always seems to be the same, and the results are very similar. Vast destruction with the inability to respond. What's really the reason for that? Is there a greater explanation, or is it just simply, it's the will of the people? The people don't want their hard-earned money to support effective countermeasures. Well, as always, I'll leave that conclusion to you. But it is quite an interesting coincidence that these impressive amusement parks with the unique architecture and their impressive legacy of being the very first amusement parks in the United States where people actively sought recreation and amusement went up in smoke, as so many other old world structures have over time, and as so many other accounts relate to over time. Now you can just simply hand wave it away and say, yes, unfortunately things happen. It's just a vast coincidence that all the most impressive structures over time went up in smoke, whether it's the Crystal Palace in the United Kingdom, or any one of the other Crystal Palaces anywhere, or any other of the numerous structures. And believe me, we don't even need to keep a list because we already have a list kept for us. They tell us what went up in smoke. The only thing that we understand is different is when things were destroyed. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? And the legacy of what remained with Coney Island. Steeplechase Park was the only park that survived in the 1960s after the fires. And of course, we may recall that in the 1960s was when the United States was facing the push for urban renewal, the concept of renewing our decaying urban centers. And of course, this led to the unbridled destruction, demolishing of these old city cores that, as we understand, were deteriorating anyway. And you can look here and see the impressive exhibition area of Steeplechase Park. And it's quite an impressive exhibitionary hall, and we'll take a look at its entire size because, once again, you might be surprised to understand just how large this playground of fun or this exhibitionary hall was for Steeplechase Park. Again, it's something else that the sheer gargantuan nature of the size is shocking, and you would expect it to be beyond the capabilities at the time to build something this immense. But apparently this is exactly what we had at Steeplechase Park. And Steeplechase Park being the last amusement park on Coney Island that did survive to the urban renewal time frame of the 1960s. And this incredible exhibitionary hall, or this attraction, or whatever you want to call it, this very large edifice that we think of when we looked at the other World's Fairs and all of their incredible expeditionary halls. Enter a real estate developer named Fred Trump. He looks rather familiar. I'm not exactly sure where I've heard that name before. Fred Trump was a very prominent real estate developer in the 1960s and took it upon himself to try to revive Coney Island, namely through Steeplechase Park. Of course, the efforts to revive Coney Island involved demolishing the playground of fun or that incredible expeditionary hall that we just looked at, as is always the case. Now, apparently there was some real estate deals that went on with Fred Trump, and over time they continued to try to revive the Coney Island amusement park, but for whatever reason it just never approached the level that it was at the early 1900s. There are still some remnants, though, of some impressive architecture if you go to Coney Island to this day. Some hints at the old world still endures in some particular ways. Unfortunately, though, the most pronounced examples, whether we're talking about either one of the great towers in Dreamland or Luna Park, are no longer with us. But there are still hints and clues that there was impressive architecture that may have been from something before. Or again, it all just may be a big coincidence. And we even have this current high school, Abraham Lincoln High School. No, I'm not making that up. Once again, we have another Abraham Lincoln High School, whether we're in Des Moines, Illinois, or anywhere in the United States, that shows impressive old world architecture. That always seems to be the situation. So perhaps some advice I can give you if you're looking for impressive old world architecture in your neighborhood, if you live in the United States, look for the high school named Abraham Lincoln High School. And if you come across one that's not old world architecture, be sure to let me know. And the incubator babies, new humans. As if we don't have enough reasons to question and explore Coney Island, the main display of incubator babies, or the infant incubators, was in Coney Island. Yes, the mainstream historical account informs us, and you can get an idea of some of this impressive architecture too, where they showcase these infants. And we've explored this before, but what was really going on here? Were these just simply a display to showcase the technology available at the time, that if you had a premature baby that it could survive in an incubator? Let's be generous here and suppose that they did want to showcase that technology. Then why did you need to have so many incubators to showcase this? Wouldn't one single incubator have done the job? And how exactly do you reconcile this with the amusement concept of what Coney Island or the amusement parks were supposed to be about? Yes, ride your roller coaster and now go see the incubator babies. And be sure to get a hot dog on your way. And look at this. Before use and after use. Baby incubator, 12 months growth in 1 hour? Now, of course, you would say that this is just simply commercialism, marketing as we'd call it today. Or is this referring to something else? We really have to ask, what's the account with these incubator babies? Were these babies that were brought in from other areas? Or was there something else going on? Is it even possible, and yes, this is going out to the far reaches of explanations, that these were actually entirely new human beings that were being designed from the ground up? An entirely new population of human beings with, dare I say, diminished physical capabilities from the previous generation of human beings? Is that what was really happening here with these incubator babies? Was this the establishment of the new generations that were going to populate this quote-unquote new world? Maybe that's just a far-fetched science fiction concept, and that's all it is. But it's very strange to see these images of these incubator babies. And I'm not showing some of the more bizarre images because they're rather disturbing, but you can certainly look up these images on your own if you're so inclined. But this very strange showcasing, this exhibition of infants and this technology, doesn't seem to reconcile with what we expect with the society at the time. And what's with this individual's headgear? This is a very unique style at the time. And I'd like to close by looking at this Stargate, this portal. What exactly is this that we're looking at? Now, this is associated with the Coney Island exhibitions, and this is stated to have been an electric building. At least, that's what the caption says, but when you look at it, there seems to be something much more elaborate behind it. Now, the official caption tells us this is Dreamland, entrance to the electric building. Yes, Dreamland, the first amusement park that went up in smoke. And when we look closely, what do we see? Again, we see these symbols, these cartouches, and these symbols that appear everywhere. Now, was this just supposed to be a temporary building? Or was this a permanent building? And again, I'm trying to reconcile the mainstream account with what's really going on. Because how could you possibly justify this? These incredible obelisks on either side of this with these cartouches on them. Again, were we showcasing our reverence for ancient Egypt and the Roman deities at the time? Or did these represent something else entirely? Because here you can see the mainstay of this cartouche. And again, I get the impression that this is some very elaborate technological device. And no, there are really no other images I could find of this particular apparatus. Is this a Stargate? Is this a portal? Is this some sort of power generation device? Is it more? Or could it be something else entirely? What do you think? Let me know in the comments, and by all means, let me know if you've seen other images of this electric building, or the entrance to the electrical building, or the entrance to the Dreamland electric building, whatever it is. Well, thank you for joining me. I hope you appreciated this exploration of Coney Island. Please like, comment, and subscribe.